This presentation is dealing with Nixon and Watergate, Trump and Russiagate, and paralleling it with the Sun and Jupiter synodic cycle, which is a 13-month cycle subdivided into 4 phases. The conjunction, where Sun and Jupiter come together, the opening square as the Sun moves away from Jupiter, the opposition, where they face off in opposition to each other, the closing square, and then the successive conjunction. So we'll start off by talking about the Sun. The Sun represents the central character in anything. So the Sun was given over to leaders such as kings or presidents or CEOs. Jupiter, on the other hand, represents the principle of justice and law. It also has connections with publication and religion. We're going to start at the Sun-Jupiter opposition of the 24th of June 1972. Now, the day before this opposition, in a meeting between the US President Richard Nixon and his Chief of Staff Harry Haldeman, they were concocting a plan to throw the FBI off the investigation of Watergate, which had happened a week before the break-in. So that's right at the opposition point of the Sun opposing Jupiter. Now, the meeting was on the 23rd, the opposition was on the 24th. It didn't work. At the next phase, which was the Sun-Jupiter closing square of 72, that happened on September 22, a week before, the 5 burglars of Watergate were indicted by a federal grand jury. John Dean, the White House counsel, on the same day, met with Nixon to discuss developmental plans on this. Now, Watergate simply wouldn't go away, and there's a good reason for that. At the next Sun-Jupiter conjunction, which happened on the 10th of January 1973, 2 days prior, the actual Watergate trial began, and the 5 burglars entered a guilty plea. Part of the reason that it wouldn't go away was that this Sun-Jupiter cycle was forming at 20 degrees of Capricorn. Richard Nixon was born with his birth sun at 19 degrees and 24 minutes of Capricorn. So the cycle was actually conjunct his birth sun and therefore unique to Nixon. At the opening square of the new cycle, further developments. On the evening of April 30th, 1973, a day before the square became perfect, Nixon went on national television to announce the resignations of White House officials Harry Haldeman and also John Ehrlichman. John Dean, his counsel, was fired, and the Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, has resigned. This is all happening at once and will come into the morning headlines on May the 1st, 1973, exactly on the square of that cycle. When we get to the opposition of Sun-Jupiter, that's 1973, 30th of July, the Senate Investigation Committee have requested some recordings from the Oval Office. Nixon recorded all conversations, but he declines to hand them over, and he adopts an avoidance approach, which was pretty much what he did on the first opposition cycle of Sun-Jupiter. On July 26th, the Senate issues a subpoena for the tapes, and things don't get any better. At the Sun-Jupiter closing square of 1973, that's happening on the 27th of October 1973, a week before, as the square is coming into exactness, Nixon takes his most extreme measures yet. He wants the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, to be fired. He summons his Attorney General to do the job on the Saturday night of October 20. The Attorney General resigns. He then summons the Deputy Attorney General, who also resigns. He finally gets Richard Bork, who, the Solicitor General, to sack Archibald Cox. But these are extreme measures, and it really doesn't get him anywhere. In his State of the Union address in 1974, he's asking the nation to put Watergate behind them, but that's exactly what they're not doing. The new conjunction is on the 13th of February, and on the 6th of February, there is a new committee set up, Judiciary Committee. This time they're looking at actually impeaching the president. Now we can see that this Sun and Jupiter conjunction are also squaring Mars here and squaring the Moon, so it's pretty volatile. By the opening square of 1974, that takes place on June 7. We see it in Gemini. and there's a publication that comes out that really sensationalizes, well, not sensationalizes, but brings it into the public awareness even more. It's called All the President's Men. And this expose, which was written with information provided by an anonymous informant known as Deep Throat, 30 years later, he'd be revealed to be an FBI special agent and associate director, Mark Felt. But the New York Times called this All the President's Men, probably the best piece of investigative journalism that they'd encountered. So we then come to the Sun opposition of 1974. This takes place on the 5th of September. Now, remember, we started on an opposition here where Nixon was trying to get out of the charges or distance himself from it. Then we had the second opposition where he's denied the Senate committee the tapes and they'd had to subpoena them. The last opposition, he's no longer president. He's resigned just before this opposition, and he's given a pardon here. So in some sense, this opposition has pitted the president against justice in a way. The pardon, unconditional pardon, is issued by Gerald Ford, who wants the nation to move forward from that time, but that's a pretty unpopular decision by Ford and destroys any hopes of his re-election. So that's Watergate. What does it have to do with Russiagate or the investigation into the Trump presidency and the legitimacy of the way he won that election? Let's have a look. We're now going to go to the Sun-Jupiter cycle, which began on the 26th of September 2016, and it happened at around 3.5 degrees of Libra, the sign of the balance of justice. And what I've done here is I've put the conjunction and put it on top of the American horoscope as well. So you'll see the Sun-Jupiter at the midheaven of the Declaration of Independence July 4 horoscope. Now the midheaven represents leadership. Now we'll also see the Sun-Jupiter is square the American Jupiter and square the American Venus, which just so happens to rule the sign on the midheaven. So this is pretty appropriate that that day the presidential debates begin, the first debate right on the day of the conjunction, September 26, 2016. And of course they're very adversarial, and that's been Trump's modus operandi from the moment that he tried to get the Republican nomination in the first place. And he wins. Now he wins the Electoral College, loses the popular vote, as it turns out, by almost 3 million votes. So it's a pretty controversial election. We come to the first square, and we see that it happens on the 11th of January 2017, and it's actually a Grand Cross. So this means that this square has a very challenging Grand Cross energy about it. It's actually making people cross as well. The moon, which represents the public in a mundane horoscope, is opposite the sun, and also squaring Uranus, the planet of independence and eccentricity. So what happens at this square, the day before, or actually on the day of the square virtually, he has his first conference as president-elect, and he takes on the press. In a similar manner to Nixon here, he's trying to destroy the credibility of the press as well. Then we come to the opposition point. That happens on the 7th of April 2017. This opposition is very important because it's also forming a T-square to Pluto, which tends to act as a power broker planet in corporate Capricorn here. And right on the day of the Sun-Jupiter opposition, Neil Gorsuch, who's a conservative, is confirmed as the 113th Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And this means that the Conservatives have the balance of power in the highest court in the land. So this tends to be a victory for the Republicans and Donald Trump when it comes to matters judicial. But at the closing square of the 5th of July 2017, there are developments in this whole Russian investigation controversy, which Trump has denied any involvement from the very start. The square is interesting too because the sun position of the square is 14 degrees of Cancer, and the square takes place the day after Independence Day. So this is going to be of interest to most Americans. At the time, Trump's at the G20. He's meeting President Putin, and he's spending extra time with Vladimir Putin here as well. A lot of rumors going around. But perhaps the most sensational one turns out to be Donald Trump's emails, which he publishes on Twitter, because the New York Times are going to publish them. And these emails reveal an interesting turn to the whole series of events. There are revelations of a secret meeting at Trump Tower that have only appeared at the closing square of Sun to Jupiter. The secret meeting involving Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and Paul Manafort, his campaign manager. So all of the denials so far have led to this. And then we come to the cycle that we're currently in. That began on the 26th of October 2017. We see the Sun and Jupiter here conjunct at 3.5 degrees, this time of Scorpio. Now, what happened here? Well, the conjunction was on the 26th. On the 27th, a federal grand jury approved the first charges in the Russiagate investigation led by the special counsel Robert Mueller. So it's very important because that is actually the start of the current cycle that we're in. And Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort and his deputy Richard Gates were charged by this investigation. Now, they pleaded not guilty so far. Where we're at now, and around the time I'm posting this, is that we're at the opening square. It takes place on the 10th of February 2018. So around this time, or within a week of this time, we can expect some significant developments. What's on the cards is Mueller is wanting to interview Bannon, who's agreed to an interview, Steve Bannon, a former national security advisor to Trump. And of course, Mueller wants to interview Trump, and Trump's saying bring it on, but will his actions actually match his words? Well, we'll see what happens there. That will go to the opposition point of the 8th of May 2018, where we are likely to see more of a face-off and things drawn to a kind of climax point around this time as well. And then we can look further down the track to the closing square, which happens on the 6th of August this year, 2018. The interesting part about this closing square is that the Sun is 14 degrees of Leo, and it just so happens to be conjunct Robert Mueller's Sun. So interesting times there. And finally, the cycle will complete and start a new one on the 26th of November 2018, and hopefully events will be wrapping up by then. And that is the Sun and Jupiter conjunct at almost 4 degrees of Sagittarius. Just so happens to be conjunct the birth sun of Steve Bannon. So, tremendous correlations. Now, it's interesting. Of course, they're just celestial cycles, but they are of interest to note. They don't have opinions of their own, but regardless of any political partnership, or partisanship rather, that's if you have that, should the public be concerned? Well, on the past evidence, you'd have to say yes, but I'll leave that judgment up to you and the heavens. If you'd like to follow this a little bit more, I have weekly updates on my website, www.edtamplin.com, and you'll find political and financial astrology regularly posted at that site. In the meantime, thanks for listening to this presentation, The Sun-Jupiter Cycle, Nixon and Trump.